The courtroom was filled with a hushed anticipation, the kind that often precedes a high-profile trial. At the front of the room sat the judge, a man in his late 40s, with a composed and focused demeanor. His gavel rested lightly in his hand, ready to bring order to the proceedings. His name was Judge Daniel Collins, a man who had worked tirelessly to build a reputation for fairness and integrity in the courtroom. His gray suit and polished shoes spoke of years of dedication to his career, but his eyes, sharp and observant, betrayed a depth of experience that stretched far beyond his legal expertise. Across from him, seated in the defendant's chair, was a man named Marcus Carter. He was in his early 40s, wearing the standard orange jumpsuit of someone awaiting trial. His face was hard, but there was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, a man caught between the weight of his past actions and the uncertainty of his future. Marcus was accused of a serious crime, one that had shocked the community, and now he was facing the full force of the law. The prosecutor, a woman named Ellen Hayes, stood confidently beside the defendant, preparing to make her opening statements. She had a reputation for being tough, methodical, and unyielding in her pursuit of justice. With her perfectly tailored suit and poised expression, she was the epitome of professionalism, her every move calculated to strike the right chord with the jury. As the proceedings began, the judge scanned the room, his mind already working through the formalities of the case. But then, as his eyes fell upon Marcus, something unexpected happened. His gaze locked onto the defendant's face, and for a brief moment, time seemed to slow down. A sudden recognition swept over him, a recognition so strong it almost took his breath away. Marcus, the man sitting before him, was someone he knew from his past, his childhood friend. Memories flooded his mind in an instant, laughter shared on summer days, the games they played, and the bond they once had. They had grown up together in a small town, both dreaming of brighter futures, unaware of how the choices they would make would lead them down vastly different paths. The realization hit him hard. How could this man, the boy he had once called a friend, now stand accused of such a heinous act? As the trial continued, Judge Collins was torn between his duty to uphold the law and the loyalty he felt for someone he had once cared for deeply. His mind raced with questions. Could he remain impartial, or was he too emotionally involved to make the right decision? The ethical dilemma weighed heavily on him, and the courtroom suddenly felt like a much larger and more complicated place than it had just moments before. As Judge Daniel Collins sat in his high-backed chair, his eyes never fully left Marcus Carter. His mind was in turmoil, drifting between the present moment and the echoes of their shared past. The years since their childhood had created an undeniable distance between them, both physically and emotionally. Marcus had grown up to face a life that was far different from Daniel's own. While Daniel had pursued his education, eventually earning his place in the courtroom, Marcus had struggled, caught in a web of poor decisions, run-ins with the law, and choices that had slowly pulled him away from the bright future they had once envisioned together. Daniel couldn't help but replay moments from their youth. He remembered how they had spent hours together, dreaming of their futures, promising each other that no matter what happened, they would always be there for each other. But somewhere along the way, their paths diverged. Daniel had attended college, followed by law school, determined to make something of himself. Marcus, on the other hand, had been caught in a cycle of bad luck, bad decisions, and bad influences. The thought of his old friend, now standing in a courtroom as a defendant accused of a crime so serious it could alter the course of his life forever, felt like a cruel twist of fate. The conflict of emotions was overwhelming. How had it come to this? How had the boy he had once known so well, someone he had trusted and respected, become the man sitting before him in chains? Anger, confusion, sadness, and disbelief warred inside him. As he sat there, Judge Collins faced a growing internal struggle. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. Should he recuse himself from the case? Was he too emotionally involved, too biased to make an impartial judgment? It was a question that gnawed at him, but every time he considered it, another part of him resisted. Could he walk away from this case and allow someone else to decide the fate of his childhood friend? Just then, the prosecutor, Ellen Hayes, began presenting the evidence against Marcus. The cold, methodical way she laid out the facts, one by one, only added to Daniel's internal turmoil. The accusations against Marcus were grave, and the evidence was compelling. His friend, the person he had once known so well, now seemed like a stranger. As the prosecutor spoke, Daniel's mind raced, struggling to separate the man before him from the memories of the boy he had once called a friend. Judge Daniel Collins sat back in his chair, his gaze momentarily drifting from the proceedings as his thoughts once again traveled back to the past. The memories were vivid, as if they had never faded, no matter how many years had passed. He could still see the two of them, young and full of hope, sitting on the steps of his house after school, talking about the future. He and Marcus had always been inseparable, two boys from the same small town, with dreams bigger than anyone else's. They had promised each other that nothing would ever break their bond, that no matter what happened, they would always be there for one another. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. Daniel had gone to college, determined to carve out a path for himself, while Marcus had stayed behind. It wasn't long before Marcus fell in with the wrong crowd, making choices that would set the course for his future. It had started small petty thefts, arguments with teachers, run-ins with the law, but over time, those small missteps had snowballed into something much darker. As the trial continued, the prosecutor began to piece together the details of Marcus's past. Daniel listened carefully, his mind reeling with each new revelation. The man sitting before him now was a far cry from the friend he had known. Marcus had been arrested several times over the years, each time for increasingly serious offenses. His brushes with the law had grown more frequent, and each time, his charges had escalated. What had once been minor mistakes had evolved into deeper, more destructive patterns of behavior. A particular incident stood out in Daniel's mind, the one that seemed to change everything. It had been a night of reckless decisions, a group of friends involved in a robbery that had spiraled out of control. Marcus had been there, and though he hadn't directly committed the crime, he had played a significant role in the events that led to the victim's harm. It was that moment when Daniel had realized that his friend, the person he had once trusted, was drifting away, no longer the man he had once known. The tension between the personal and the professional began to weigh heavily on Daniel. How could he remain objective? How could he be the judge in this case when the defendant was someone he had once loved like a brother? As the evidence continued to mount, Daniel found it increasingly difficult to keep his emotions in check. He knew his duty, but the memories of their shared past were clouding his judgment, pulling him deeper into the dilemma of whether he could truly separate his feelings from the facts of the case. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew tense as the trial entered a pivotal moment. The prosecutor, Ellen Hayes, had just finished presenting her evidence against Marcus, painting a damning picture of the defendant's past and present. She had methodically laid out the timeline of his criminal history, each piece of evidence seemingly cementing Marcus's guilt in the eyes of the jury. But then, just when it seemed like the case was nearing its conclusion, something unexpected happened. The defense attorney, a calm and calculated man named Richard Sullivan, rose to his feet. He had been relatively quiet throughout the proceedings, but now, with an air of quiet confidence, he presented new evidence that caused a stir in the courtroom. He slid a photograph across the table to the judge, the prosecutor, and the jury, showing a different side of Marcus, a side that had never been revealed before. The photograph was of Marcus with a man Daniel recognized instantly. It was his father, a well-respected businessman in town, someone who had always been known for his integrity. The photo was taken years ago at a charity event in the community, showing Marcus in a suit standing beside his father in front of a large crowd. The image, one that Daniel had never seen before, was powerful. Marcus once again looked like the man he had known years ago, a man with potential and promise, not the hardened criminal who sat before him now. The revelation rocked Daniel to his core. How had he not known about this connection? The defense argued that Marcus had been trying to turn his life around for years, that his past was not entirely defined by his mistakes, but by a series of circumstances and influences beyond his control. The defense painted a picture of a man who, despite his criminal history, was not beyond redemption. As Daniel absorbed this new information, he began to suspect that there might be more to the case than he had initially thought. The evidence seemed to suggest that Marcus's criminal actions weren't as clear-cut as they appeared. It raised questions about the real reasons behind his fall from grace. Had Marcus been set up? Was there something more sinister at play? However, as much as he tried to maintain objectivity, Daniel couldn't shake the personal bias that was creeping into his judgment. The memory of the boy he had once called his best friend kept fighting its way into his thoughts. The more he tried to detach himself, the harder it became to separate his feelings from the facts. His internal conflict deepened, and the weight of his past relationship with Marcus threatened to cloud his ability to make an unbiased decision. The pressure on Judge Daniel Collins was unbearable. As the trial progressed, the weight of the decision he had to make grew heavier with each passing moment. He could feel the eyes of the jury, the prosecutor, and even the defense attorney on him, waiting for him to speak, to make a ruling. But it wasn't just the courtroom's pressure that consumed him, it was the storm brewing inside his own mind. His personal connection to Marcus, the man sitting in front of him, kept clouding his judgment, and he could feel the battle within him intensifying. He sat in silence, recalling the pivotal moments of the trial. He thought back to the defense's unexpected argument, the photo of Marcus with his father, and the revelation that Marcus hadn't been entirely beyond redemption. Those moments had shaken him, causing him to question everything he had thought he knew about his childhood friend. Was Marcus truly guilty of the crime he had been accused of, or was he the victim of circumstances that had spiraled beyond his control? Then, there was the defendant's testimony. Marcus had been surprisingly open and honest, his voice shaking with emotion as he spoke about the choices that had led him to this point. The remorse in his eyes was genuine, and yet Daniel couldn't ignore the history of his criminal behavior. It was clear that Marcus had struggled, but did that mean he should be absolved of his actions? Marcus had claimed he wanted to change, to make amends, but was that enough to outweigh the evidence that had been presented? The legal strategies employed by both sides only complicated Daniel's decision further. The prosecutor's case had been airtight, filled with damning evidence and an argument that left little room for doubt. But the defense, using the photograph and Marcus's testimony, had introduced a new layer of complexity to the situation. Could a man with a troubled past still be deserving of a second chance? And if so, what did that mean for justice? Daniel's mind raced. He had spent years cultivating an unwavering commitment to the law, but now, in the face of his own past, his principles were being tested in ways he had never imagined. How could he remain impartial when the defendant was someone he had once loved like a brother? He thought of the nights spent together as children, the dreams they had shared, and the bond they had forged over years of friendship. How could he possibly reconcile that with the man Marcus had become? And yet, how could he ignore the law, the rules he had sworn to uphold, simply because of their shared history? The moment of reckoning came, when the courtroom grew silent, waiting for him to speak. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, and for a brief moment, the world around him seemed to fade. He had to make a decision, and it wasn't just a decision about guilt or innocence, it was about the very nature of justice itself. Was he willing to let his friendship cloud his judgment, or would he uphold the law, no matter the personal cost?
The final twist came when Marcus, sensing the internal struggle in the judge, made a quiet but profound remark. "I never wanted to drag you into this, Danny," he said, using the nickname from their childhood. "I never wanted to make you choose between your duty and your past." In that moment, Daniel knew what he had to do. He wasn't just a judge. He was a man who had to live with the consequences of his actions, no matter how difficult the choice. He looked up at Marcus, then at the jury, and with a heavy heart, he made his decision. The line between justice and friendship was thin, but in the end, Daniel chose justice. It wasn't easy, but it was the only choice that truly honored the oath he had taken. The moment the judge's decision was announced, the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Judge Daniel Collins, with a solemn expression, declared that Marcus Carter was guilty of the crime he had been accused of. The room was silent, the weight of the verdict settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. The prosecutor, Ellen Hayes, nodded subtly, her expression neutral but satisfied. She had secured the conviction she had worked so hard for. The defense attorney, Richard Sullivan, was visibly disappointed but composed, his professional demeanor intact. Marcus, however, was a different story. His face, which had been calm throughout most of the trial, now crumpled with a mixture of resignation and sadness. He had expected it, perhaps even known it deep down, but hearing the words spoken aloud made it all the more real. His gaze briefly met Daniel's, and for a moment, the years of shared history between them seemed to hang in the air. There was no anger in Marcus's eyes, only a quiet understanding. This was the consequence of his actions, and despite the bond they once shared, justice had to be served. The courtroom's reaction was mixed. Some members of the jury appeared relieved, their expressions satisfied that the law had been upheld. Others seemed more somber, perhaps reflecting on the complexity of the case and the man they had come to know through the trial. It wasn't just about the crime, it was about the man behind it, and the deeper story of lost potential and broken dreams that had played out before them. The verdict wasn't just a victory for the legal system, it was a reminder of how life could shape a person in ways that were sometimes beyond their control. For Judge Collins, the aftermath was far from simple. The decision he had made weighed heavily on him, a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. He had done what he believed was right, but it didn't feel right. His friendship with Marcus had been shattered by the law, and the personal cost of his decision left him questioning his own values. Could he truly separate justice from the emotions tied to his past? In many ways, he had hoped he could, but the reality of the situation proved that the two were more intertwined than he had ever imagined. For Marcus, the verdict was a harsh reality. He was led away in handcuffs, but there was no bitterness in his departure. His life had been defined by mistakes, and the trial had shown him that there was no escaping the consequences. Yet there was a sense of closure in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement that he had been seen for who he truly was: flawed, human, and deserving of both punishment and the possibility of redemption. As the courtroom emptied, Daniel remained seated for a long while, reflecting on the true meaning of justice, loyalty, and the complexity of human relationships. Loyalty to his past had not outweighed his duty to the law, but in the end, he realized that the true complexity of justice wasn't in the decision itself, it was in the human cost of that decision. The lines between right and wrong were never as clear as they seemed, and sometimes the hardest choices were the ones that left the deepest scars.